and we are the Y'all Show. Talk with a Southern accent. Our website is Yall.com, Yall.com. Y'all, the ultimate guide to the South. And you can also catch us on great radio stations across the Southland and, of course, podcast form on Apple iTunes as well as Yall.com. You can go there. Right now, we're going to go to the phone line. We've got a very special guest joining us right here on today's Y'all Show. As our next guest, John O'Connor, is a guy who knows the law. He's a former federal prosecutor, and he has a book out that ties into the Watergate era as he wrote the book Postgate, and we'll discuss that with him. But right now, welcome into the Y'all Show, Mr. John O'Connor. John O'Connor, Esquire.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that intro.
Yes, and
I accept.
You accept.
Yeah.
Well, I was reading through your bio, John, which, by the way, you got a great first name, but I have to feel sorry for you. You're a confused fella. You went to undergrad at Notre Dame and law school at the University of Michigan. Those two things don't really mix too well.
Well, they don't. They don't, except that you just follow your heart. And unfortunately, as much as I'm a Wolverine fan, when it comes time to Notre Dame versus Michigan, I think I know where my heart is. And, so go Irish is all I can say.
Well, y'all have both had pretty good football seasons here in the last couple of years, so it's not too bad. Of course, we're in the South here with the Y'all Show, so unfortunately, I think the Southern teams have kind of got the best of both the Wolverines and the Irish, but we won't hold that against any of those teams. John, you wrote the book Postgate, How the Washington Post Betrayed Deep Throat, Covered Up Watergate, and Began Today's Partisan Advocacy Journalism. And I want to know the history of that book, and then we'll actually tie into what's going on here in today's world with the coronavirus and such. You're seeing a lot of executive authority being bounced around, and I know you've got something to say about all of that. But first off, what led you to go from being a lawyer, where you have been very successful in your legal career, to being an author of Postgate?
Well, John, it's sort of funny. I represented Mark Felt, Deep Throat. I'd always had an interest in it since my days as a federal prosecutor. Figured out who he was back in 1976, and then just by chance found out that the fellow who I had identified, Mark Felt, was not only living right near me, but that my daughter was very good friends with his grandson. They were going to school together. I asked if I could come up and see Deep Throat and so forth, and the fun began. And I finally talked him into coming out. But in the course of that, John, more to the point, in the course of that, I kept getting, in my relationships with the Post and my interactions, I kept getting my head put into the dumpster. And finally, I decided I better dive in. There was something odd and strange about their reactions to me and what I wanted to write about Watergate. And I had and I write about it in the book. It's what led me to write the book. And as it turns out, lo and behold, after I read 3,000 Watergate articles and compare them with everything that was known and knowable at the time, I find that they really were quite deceitful and fraudulent, I would say, in their reporting of Watergate. It's not to say that Richard Nixon didn't technically commit a crime. There were fairly thin obstruction cases, but he was guilty. But what was he covering up? The Post doesn't tell you that. The Post doesn't tell you that this really was not a White House campaign effort in Watergate, as everyone has thought for the last 45 years. And Nixon, therefore, was not covering up something his aides did to help him unfairly get elected. And I go into that, and the amount of deceit, knowing deceit by a major media figure. And remember, the Post was had a monopoly on that coverage. They were the only paper that was covering it. They were local. They had all the sources. Other people were not quick to pick up. The television stations were not covering it or investigating. So they had the field to themselves. And when they had that field, they decided they would cover up in favor of their buddies, the Democratic National Committee. The Post was joined at the hip with the DNC, and they decided to jump on a partisan side. And that's where I say, John, that is where today's partisan journalism started. Watergate was a case of historical fraud, a serious historical fraud where Richard Nixon didn't get a fair trial. He was guilty of crime, but should he have been removed? Well, he's far less guilty of crimes than Bill Clinton, but the context of Clinton's crimes were such that half the people said, no, he shouldn't go. Okay, he doesn't get removed. Nixon didn't have that chance to present his defense. And my real point is, it's not just historical fraud, big historical fraud. That reporting it was like the Magna Carta for today's journalists. It made them into a fourth branch of government. It made them unaccountable, and the prosecutor, judge, and jury for all things public. And unfortunately, part of the message was that journalists are now political players. They're political powers. Once you become a political power, you're no longer out there saying telling both sides of the story. You're not there to tell all the facts. You don't win Pulitzer Prizes. You don't get a McMansion and a lot of adoring attention by telling all sides. You get a high-level scalp. And John, so the way I compare it is this. Now it's monetized. Now if you can get that big scalp like Woodward and Bernstein did, it comes attached to a lot of money, fame, power, awards. So let's say I'm a contingent fee lawyer that's got a case, and I'm going to get a bag of money if I can get the jury to go along with me. Let's say I can go to court without a judge or opposing counsel and just talk to the jury. And I get a contingent fee on it. Am I going to is human nature such that I'm going to tell the jury the strengths of the other guy's side? No, I'm not. I'm going to omit some facts. I'm going to leave them on the cutting room floor. And I hate to say that because we're all the same way. Everyone would probably be in that situation. You wouldn't tell all the truth. And that's what we've got now. Now we've got a monolithic media that really doesn't have anybody out there seriously fighting them. They are just basically all on one side, and there's no internal opposition. There's no balance. And so what do we get? We get reporting that is essentially fraudulent for the most part. When I say fraudulent, omitting key facts, ignoring facts. That's fraud in my world, in lawyers' world. The papers may not think of it that way. They may think they're just being clever. But in my world, that's fraud. The Enron people all go to jail because they omitted things from their financial reports. People who omit things go to jail, except in one situation, if you're part of the media. So then I draw that line to Ukraine-gate and Russia-gate. They're examples of that, where the major media, the mainstream media, left key facts on the floor so that we didn't get them, and the public was deceived as to what was really going on. I'm saying a lot here, John, but let me add one thing, and then I'll let you talk for a while.
The floor is yours, John O'Connor.
But let me just tell you this. I've been looking at the New York Times reporting on the coronavirus. And I am sickened by the partisan slant that has to be put on this, on something where we're all in on it. The virus does not distinguish between Republican, Democrat, and Independent. And yet, President Trump can't do anything right. He can't do anything right. You look at he tries to reassure the public. In the New York Times, there's an editorial, it's propaganda. It's propaganda, I think Jennifer Senior said. Maureen Dowd said, why can't President Trump be more like Dr. Fauci? Well, he's got a different role than Dr. Fauci. You go to the Second World War. There's a great book out now about Winston Churchill's rhetoric. It saved the Western world because he in a time of crisis, he was positive. He knew we had to fight, but he was positive, and the media endorsed him. When
Blood,
Franklin Roosevelt,
sweat, and toil.
That's right. We have nothing. I can offer you nothing but Yeah, all that, and then Franklin Roosevelt. I don't think he was a great president, but he did instill in people confidence that we get through the Depression. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. And the media went along with him and helped amplify the message, and we stayed unified through times of crisis. You look at Sunday's paper, just in the Times. I just went through it to just for fun. News articles that aren't news articles. They talk. One news article says this crisis is too big for the big talk of Trump. He's just a guy. He's used to bluffing banks and being a blustery real estate guy. Well, excuse me, what's he supposed to do? He's supposed to give us hopeful rhetoric, and he's doing that. He's also measured. But my point is that it is not helping anyone to be partisan at this time. We can save that for later, and we can throw the big brickbats later. But this media has got their partisan jerseys on to such an extent that even when Governor Cuomo and Governor Newsom, who are partisans, are taking off their jerseys and they're trying to be constructive about it because they understand how important it is. So President Trump, Governor Newsom, Governor Cuomo, they're working together and they're complimenting each other, and they're trying to give people confidence that their leaders are helping them. And therefore, the public is more likely to unify in a response, and we can beat this thing. And we'll do what they tell us to do. But if we have this rhetoric now that it's just divisive, it's not helpful. But we have, I guess what I'm saying, John, is there were a lot of seeds of discontent sowed in Watergate, and we now have a partisan media that cannot stop. I don't think there's a lot of intelligence coming from them. There probably never was, but we never put them in an exalted role. So when I write about this in Watergate, it's not really just about Watergate. It's about the whole ball of wax that started with Watergate. And it troubles me greatly, and it should trouble all of us. So now I've vented, John,
Yeah.
and
Okay, you can go take your
sorry
nap
to
now.
monopolize. Yeah, exactly.
We're talking with legal analyst and author John O'Connor, and the book title of his book. It might be the longest book title I've ever seen. Postgate. By the way, John, can you recite this thing? Do you have the whole book title?
Sure.
Okay. Well, hold
Sure.
on.
Sure.
Let me.
Postgate. Sure.
Okay, go for it.
How the Washington Post betrayed Deep Throat, covered up Watergate, and began today's partisan advocacy journalism.
Yes, he gets an A plus, and that's the name again. The short answer to that would be Postgate, and that's been out, and it's a good read. And as he said, it ties into some of this madness we've seen in the last 3 years with the President Trump impeachment, the collusion, I've almost lost track of everything. The Mueller probe, and now I'm sure somehow or another they'll likely try to get him in on this whole coronavirus thing. I will say it had to be a little bit odd for you as a guy who was tied into the Watergate, the efforts there in the legal field of it, to see a guy named Bernstein on CNN a lot while the impeachment trial was going on.
Well, you not only had Bernstein, who, of course, just that was his day in the sun. But you also had John Dean talking about it a lot.
I forgot about him.
Well, here's a guy who really led the cover-up, number one, but also was involved to a great degree in the planning of the burglary. So he was the guy that started this. And by the way, it was unbeknownst to any of the higher-ups. Nixon, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, all the big guys. Mitchell had nothing to do with this. He was falsely charged. The big guys didn't know about this burglary. The highest that went up, in my view, was to John Dean. That's my view of the evidence, and I think many people agree with that who've really studied this. And he also led the cover-up. Each of Nixon's acts that they got him on were on the advice of John Dean and in the urging of John Dean. So, now he's a great expert in how immoral everyone else is. And look, I kind of like the guy personally, John Dean, and I'm happy that he's doing well for himself and he's making a living. So I don't begrudge him that personally. But I just wonder about CNN thinking that this is the guy that you want to listen to for truth, justice, and the American way. I'm not so sure I go along with that, but we have a funny world.
We
And
do.
meanwhile, we have a president that had his churlish side. There's no doubt Nixon had sort of a dark side, but he was one heck of a president. And we got rid of him. And I'm not really blaming Dean for this so much as I am the Washington Post. The Washington Post should have reported this right. They didn't. And I go into it in my book, and it's impossible to read my book and not say, wow, one of the biggest scandal in our nation's history, and it was procured by fraud by the media.
One footnote to that the Watergate era that I want to ask about, the guy that you represented, Mark Felt, what became of him?
Well, what he did was, and this is interesting, John, he left the Bureau, and while he was going into the garage, but while he was at the Bureau, he was the number 2 man in the FBI. Mm-hmm. He died in 2008 at a very ripe age of, I think, 93 or 94. But while he was going into the garage with Woodward, he also saw that there was a big terrorist threat looming in America. The PLO had just slaughtered Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics, and they were in the United States plotting to kill thousands of Jewish citizens. The Weather Underground was bombing 50 buildings. They were making nail bombs to put through the flesh of young enlisted men and their dates at a dance. The stuff they were doing was terrible. And Mark Felt did what today we would call FISA searches. FISA was invented because of Mark Felt's case. FISA has a court. For your listeners, FISA is you have a FISA court, and that was instituted just so that people like Mark Felt, if they thought that there was a need for these type of warrantless searches, not constitutional searches for terrorism, they could get pre-approval by a court. In the old days, before 1978, it was just a matter up to the discretion of the executive branch, the president and his delegates. And Mark Felt got wrongly convicted for that. People got very, very liberal after Watergate and thought that, well, any search that's not constitutional, you should go to jail for. Well, that's not true. We're doing FISA searches today, every day. And they're not constitutional searches. They're extra constitutional. They're executive branch searches not authorized by the Bill of Rights. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Yep. Abraham Lincoln came into office knowing that he could not free the slaves. You had the Dred Scott decision. In any case, you had the Fifth Amendment. Slaves were considered property. You couldn't just free the slaves without just compensation. However, once the Civil War started, Lincoln said, aha, I can now free the slaves. So he did the Emancipation Proclamation. A few of us have heard of that.
Well, he only freed the slaves in areas that the Union had occupied. It didn't free them in the North.
Correct. It did not free them in the 4 non-belligerent states where slaves were owned. Mm-hmm. And because he didn't have a national security reason for freeing the slaves in those states. But my point is that the Bill of Rights does not constrain national security searches. If you have a terrorist organization, you don't need to wait until they've committed their act before you do something about it. It's common sense. It's protection of our country. And Mark Felt really got the shaft on this. Now, unfortunately, they remedied something that probably didn't need to be remedied, because up to that point, the FBI was very cautious about when they did these things, because they knew that if they did them wrongly, they would have to account. Then what we did by having these FISA courts, because of Mark Felt's case where he was wrongly convicted, Reagan pardoned him. They started this FISA process. Well, what's the matter with the FISA process? What's the matter with it is that if you have a rogue agent that wants to do a search for political reasons, as happened recently, you go down to some guy with black robes on that doesn't know anything about what you're doing. And all you have to do is hornswoggle him into giving you a warrant, and you're protected. So that's exactly what happened. So, we would all love to get our expenses approved by the dumbest person in the office. Okay. And that's what happens with FISA. We're now going to somebody and we're saying, who's got black robes on, saying, if you don't give us this warrant, judge, the whole Western world is going to blow up. We've got this guy running for president that's a Russian agent. We better do something about it. Well, of course that guy's going to give a warrant. He's trying to do his best job. I don't blame the judge, but I do blame the rogue agents. So what we've done is, but anyway, that's Mark Felt. And Mark Felt had a profound impact on our country's history, both in terms of Watergate. Now, Mark Felt knew a lot of the facts that I talk about in my book that were never published by Woodward. For example, Mark Felt knew very well that the CIA was deeply, deeply involved in Watergate. Woodward would not, and Bernstein and the Post would not report what Deep Throat knew about the CIA. Why? Because it would also point to the DNC and their activities. And they didn't want the DNC and the CIA were protected in Watergate is my thesis. Mark Felt knew it. So you can talk about how anonymous sources might lie to reporters, but more important is, are reporters really fully telling the public what their anonymous sources are telling them? And in my thesis, Mark Felt knew a lot more than the Post published. And he was a great hero. He was very straight. He wasn't out to get Nixon. He wasn't doing that. He was just wanted to make sure that the Bureau's investigation was not obstructed. And that's why he went to Woodward, just so he could get a blast in the press so that the investigation would not be prematurely closed. Now, he didn't have any idea what would happen after that point and all the different things that came out of it. But that wasn't his intention. His intention was not to get rid of President Nixon. A lot of people think that, but it's just not so. He was quite a patriot. I got to know him in his later years, and there's nothing more he liked than singing the Star-Spangled Banner or America the Beautiful. He's a great guy. He loved the Bureau. He loved the Bureau and our system of justice down to his bones.
We are wrapping up our conversation with legal analyst and author John O'Connor here on today's Yall show, and he wrote the book that we've been talking about, Postgate. And John, as we wrap up our conversation with you, I want to quickly get your take on, as you talk about some of this abuse in the past, I want to get your take on what's going on right now with the coronavirus. We've seen governors who've mandated these issues where you have to stay in your house, you have to stay quarantined, all these other issues going on like that. And I want to ask, is the federal government or local governments, are they usurping the First Amendment and other rights people have by doing these powers?
Well, here's what I would say. There was a song the Chambers Brothers came out, Time Has Come Today. Mm-hmm. Time is everything. I think emergency measures are fine as long as they are limited. Where the rubber's going to meet the road, John, is what happens if 30 days down the line we still cannot practice our professions, if a contractor can't go out there and build a house, if a restaurateur can't open his doors. Now I think you're talking about a taking. I think you're talking about the Fifth Amendment, which says the government can't take your property without due process or without just compensation. I think that's the issue. And the government has a lot of emergency police powers. I'm willing to be a good soldier here for a while, but after a point, I just think we face serious constitutional issues. So my main hope here is that we're playing a game of beat the clock, that we can get medicines out there and treatment so that at least to some extent people can go out there with appropriate precautions and social distancing and do their jobs and get back to work. Because the other half of this is, I'm not so sure who pays for this. You say the government's going to pay for it. Well, we're all going to pay for this. We're all in it together, and we're just all piling up debt. on each other if we continue to stay in our house. Now, for right now, hopefully, by flattening out the pandemic, by giving our industry time to get medicines and treatment and masks and test kits, we can save money in treatment. We can save money that way. So I do think it's a question of degree and of time. But during the San Francisco earthquake, uh, they started blowing up houses. They exploded houses, and a court decision said that's just fine. The government can do that. It was an emergency. The city was burning. You have the power to do it. Uh, that's limited. You can't go around and blow up houses all the time.
Yeah.
It better be World War III. It better be. So I think, John, I would say everything is qualified and limited. There are no absolutes, but at a certain point here, I think the Constitution is going to go to shreds, and I don't know what we do about it. Frankly, I just think it's very ominous to me.
Let's hope it doesn't get that far. And if it does, or if this continues, John O'Connor, this may provide you plenty of material for another book. So you'll have to get
There
after
may be.
it. Again, thank
Well,
you for
John,
coming on the Y'all Show, and we appreciate your book and for your time here talking about the Watergate and more.
call me anytime, John.
All right.
Take care. All
John
right. See you
O'Connor.
now.
All right. Thank you very much. More of the Y'all Show will continue right after this. Don't you go anywhere.